So like many good projects, this security question and answer security questions aren't really anything new. There's been research done on them. They've been used in many cases for 20 plus years. And I didn't really intend to set out to actually look at them this time around. What happened was back in December, January time frame, it's kind of my side project where I run a website, passwordresearch.com. I was looking at password dumps. These are the paste bin type files that you find where someone's hacked into a website, they dump their entire databases through SQL injection or through some other means like that. They post it up there for glory or for bragging rights or to make some sort of political message or just to embarrass the site. So I was really focused on password hashing and passwords and found several different dumps that led me to take another look at security questions. So as far as security questions go, anybody here not use security questions or not familiar with what they are? Essentially, it's those questions that someone asks you as an alternative authenticator. So instead of either in addition to your password or when you've forgotten your password as a backup authenticator, or in those cases where they want to supplement the authentication, sometimes they will ask you for a security question. What is your mother's maiden name? What was your favorite color? Things like that. These really became popular kind of along with websites because every time they could kind of hand the user responsibility for their own password reset process, that's one less email they have to hire someone to respond to or phone call. So they kind of offloaded the responsibility in a lot of cases back to the user to try to help themselves. The challenge from a security perspective is that we know, most of us probably know, that this is a trade-off because they've already forgotten their password. Do we really want to give them something else difficult to remember? In many cases, the decision was no, so let's trade how easy it is for them to remember these challenge question or these security question answers compared to passwords. That doesn't really put us in a good position, and I think a lot of us have understood that security questions aren't great. Part of the problem, though, is making that justification to your management or helping guide policy decisions, or even if you're just trying to do penetration testing, knowing what types of questions to have answered. So sometimes you'll hear them called, I call them challenge questions. I like that name better, but security questions is pretty much what most people have settled on. But you also hear them called secret questions, which is a bad thing because they're not really relying on secret information. They're really relying more on information that people may not have readily available about a specific person, or that's a little bit more difficult to predict.
More on
Yeah, good example. Last month, DigiNinja, who's, if you don't know him, he's makes some great security tools. He's over in England, and he also does a cool password analysis tool called PwdRsch that does analysis once you've cracked your passwords. Anyway, he was on a train, and apparently there was plenty of people sharing this information. And he was pointing out it was a great opportunity for gathering those secrets that you could use later. Of course, part of the problem with security questions is you've got different types of attacks. You've got attacks from anonymous people on the internet who don't know you. They may have just guessed your email address or your username and are trying to get into your account, or any account. They don't really care whose it is. Then there's the people who may want to specifically get into your account but don't know you personally, but are willing to do some research and try to either use social networking sites, data gathering types of services, or maybe social engineering. And then there are the people that actually know you, your trusted associates. I know that a couple years ago there was some research done on identity theft, and a reasonable percentage of it, 15–20% of it was done by someone that person knew, either a family member, someone, friend, someone in their life, roommate. So in some cases, you may be better off not having those associates to betray your secrets later on. In this case, this is one of the studies, and one of the things, like I said, there's been about 20 plus years of research on security questions, but in some cases, when they've asked people, how do you use security questions, what questions do you use, what answers do you have, they've relied on surveys in a lab type study environment, which is great, but obviously sometimes we know people don't behave the same way in studies when they know they're being watched as they do in the real world. This one down at the bottom, if you're actually interested in looking into some of these research papers, I've got a resources page that will tell you what paper to look into. So what I found back in December was 3 different basically database dumps that appeared on the internet in various forms of publicity. And they all kind of were slightly different environments. The first one, I kind of code-named them Alpha, Echo, and Sierra. The first one was a business resourcing / networking type site. It was, you want to list your cleaning service on the internet. You create an account, signed in, and listed your information. Or if you wanted to have some business answers to certain, how do I get this form to fill out this business license or whatever, things like that. This was actually released as part of I think it was Project White Fox. You guys remember that big dump of a whole bunch of different companies? Anyway, this happened to be a part of that. Echo was a very large one. This was one I had to dig around a little bit to find after I had seen a smaller subset about this. One thing that some hackers like to do with password dumps is instead of doing the actual work of hacking a site, they just copy someone else's, put their name on top, and repost it. So that was kind of what had happened in this case. I found a small, like 300 record subset, and doing some internet searches based on that, I found, hey, it's actually 800, 900,000 users in this environment. And then Sierra was a more focused and smaller environment of teachers in the Philippines for basically some tutoring on technology stuff. Now, for those of you interested, all 3 of these sites were running PHP. One of the byproducts of my research on password dumps back in January was finding that 91% of the sites that I found, their passwords dumped, were running PHP. So, not that you can't prevent SQL injection types attacks, but it seems to be more of a challenge for people that are setting up those sites or using their content management systems. All right, the information was different also as far as what was dumped. With Alpha and Echo, we really had username, email address, password, which was plain text, by the way, security question, security answer, and I think in the case of Alpha, you also had the person. They just had a name field, so it could be full name, first name, whatever. But Sierra actually had a lot more information that they gathered during registration. They had your greetings, so whether you were Mr. or Mrs. Ms. They had age, you had your birth date in there. They had educational titles, so doctor, master's degree, bachelor's. So I was able to look a little bit more interesting. How do these things affect, or do they affect people's question selection and answer selection? So to kind of give you a quick view of what people were seeing when they were signing up for these sites, these are obviously edited copies of what they saw on the registration pages. So anybody notice anything about what information is being presented to the user about what the security, they call them secret questions in a couple of these cases, but what the security question, what it's being used for, what users should worry about when filling this information out. They're really lacking, except for in the case of Echo over there, you can say, where they say the secret Q&A are used to recover your account if you forgot your password. Users really aren't being given any instructions whatsoever as to what this is going to be used for or what users should be worried about. And sometimes, just like when you're creating your password, they'll say, here's our guidelines for using a stronger password. There's nothing like that for security questions on this particular case. The other thing you'll notice is that only in the case of Sierra, they have pre-selected questions that drop down, which I'll show you what the actual questions were here in a minute. But in Alpha and Echo...
Hey Bruce, I don't know if you know this, but we have a tradition. Wait, hold on, no point. We have a tradition here at SecKC about first-time talkers. They have to take a shot. So, I have a surrogate shot taker here. Her name is Mimi. So, everybody ready?
Yeah!
Shot! Thank you. All right, let's do that.
Thank you. So users in Alpha and Echo's cases are actually being asked to write their own security question and their own answer. And to me, I say this is insanity, but I find out after doing some further research that some people have actually kind of recommended this approach because they say, well, it gives users flexibility. They can choose what questions they want to have answered, what questions they want to ask. Obviously, if someone asks you, what's your oldest child's name, and you don't have kids, that question's not applicable. So this gives the control back to users to knowing exactly what kind of questions they're going to be answering in this process. And again, I say this is probably not a good idea. But what I found, there's sites out there that use this in very secure environments. This is Cisco's secure messaging or secure registered envelope service, which is their cloud-based secure email system where they either let you choose from one of their pre-selected questions or write one of your own and write your own answer. We'll talk a little bit more about why this is dangerous, but in the two studies that I kind of referenced here, the first one was they surveyed users in a similar type of situation where they asked them write a security question to provide authenticated access to this image. And then they asked people, how long did you spend coming up with that question to secure this? And they said 15 seconds. Probably not a sufficient amount of time to really think through, is this a good question? How many possible answers are there? Who else would know this information? Is this something that someone's going to have on a word list somewhere? And one of the other things that they found out in a different study, actually, the second one, is that users typically prioritized memorability. 70% of the users said that memorability was very important, compared to only about 44% that said security was very important. If they understand what this process is, they're going to know I forgot my password, I don't want to forget my security answer, so I'm going to potentially make something that's easier to guess. Yes?
So, I just make it random. So, my dog's first name is Big Tits. My grandmother's maiden name is Big Tits. So, I mean, it's stuff that...
Is that a family name?
I've got like 10 of them, or 12 of them, right? That I can remember. Is that in the study?
I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I don't think...
It's all the individual hashes.
Yeah, inherently providing fake
package that people download as far as like questions?
What I've seen, it depends on if you buy RSA's package for authentication, they come with 150 questions that you don't have to write your own. Other times people do just come up with their own. Like I saw one the other day, which was, I probably have a screenshot of it somewhere, but it was like, what's the last digit of your phone number? So people come up with ridiculous questions. There is a pretty good site called goodsecurityquestions.com, which, yeah, it's just another developer that said, okay, here are the characteristics of good questions, so here's some questions that kind of fit into that. That's kind of the sources that I've seen. Otherwise, you can go to, Citibank and start through their enrollment process and look at what kind of questions they use.
So that only works on the subset of products that even allow you to specify your own.
Right.
Just have to pick from the list.
If you're using some commercial package that doesn't let you customize questions, you're kind of stuck with what you have, or you have to decide not to use that particular case, that solution. So the 5 questions that in the Sierra case that users were given a choice between were the following here. And one of the things we look at when it comes to security questions is it a fact that they're trying to answer, or is it an opinion? An opinion/preference is how I reference that. So, what is your pet's name? That's a fact. Anybody that knows your pet's name is going to have the same answer for that question. Now, maybe everyone's not going to know that answer, but it remains the same regardless of who you are. As far as that person's individual pet's name is always going to be the same thing. Opinions are more like favorites. So what is your favorite movie? What is your favorite author? What is your favorite job? Those are things which can change over time, can be more subject to whims or indecision during the question answering process. In fact, the study I referenced here found that factual questions were about 10% more likely to be guessed by an acquaintance that knew the user, but favorites were more subject to change. The user was more likely to forget it the next time they tried to use the recovery question system. So in this case, this is kind of the breakdown. In this particular case, they had kind of a mixture, 5 questions, so about half and half. Yes?
Did they check factual current questions versus factual asked questions? usually I see what is your first pet's name versus what is your pet's name.
Right. Those would both be, in your example, is something that's not current, but it was a past fact, and those are both considered facts. Obviously, it might be more difficult for someone to know what your original pet name is. Maybe less likely for that to come up in a conversation organically. Hey, what was your first pet? Mine was, whatever. But that's certainly one distinction between different types of factual questions. Yes?
Do you find that, so for the example, for the pet's name, do you find that they have any restrictions around the question? So let's say that I say my pet's name is pound, and then the name of the dog. Have you found like them saying like,
Yeah, in these cases, the question was, do the people designing these challenge question systems, security questions, are they putting restrictions on character input? And the answer is some do, some don't. In this case, for the most part, they didn't put any restrictions on what your pet's name was. We'll talk a little bit about length restrictions, where Sierra did actually have minimum length, and the others didn't. But that's really the restrictions you typically see. Sometimes you will see, and if you try to put like even a dash or a period in your answer, it won't allow that. So this is a breakdown of selection of just the question by the different users, of the 1,036 users in this particular case. And the reason I broke it out, because like I said, I had gender information. Men were the minority. They were about 22% of the users were men, and the other 78% were women. But you can kind of see the total is combined, both men and women, and then the individual gender breakdowns on just the selection of what questions they wanted to use. And there's a couple interesting things. First of all, you can see that question number 1, which is what's your pet's name, was very popular. What's your teacher's last name, number 2 was okay. Number 3 was what's your title of your favorite book. Cousin's first and last name was the least popular. And then country that you'd like to take your dream vacation in was second most popular. But you can kind of notice there are some somewhat statistically significant trends in the first and last questions. Men seem to like the pet question more, women seem to like the dream vacation question more. Is that going to help you from an attacker or defense standpoint? You certainly want to make sure that your questions, if you're offering them, are going to be suitable to both genders, but you may also say, well, hey, that question number 4, what's your cousin's first and last name, which is actually pretty good, your oldest cousin's first and last name, it's actually a pretty good question, and not very many people chose it. So why is that? Is it because it required too much thinking about who is my oldest cousin, their last name and first name is this, or is it just a matter of these other questions were more attractive, they appealed to the users more? So the other thing, once I actually looked at the answers then, I measured ignoring case, so uppercase or lowercase didn't matter, but punctuation, spelling did matter. Which questions had answers that were duplicated more than one time? So 2 users chose the same answer, 2 or more users chose the same answer. So question 1, pet name, you can see about 14% of the question, of the answers were a duplicate of someone else's. So Brownie, I think, was the number 1 top name. Maybe a popular name for pets in the Philippines, I don't know. I haven't gotten that far into digging into it. So not too bad. Same with teachers' last names, about 9.7% had a teacher with the same last name. You see it growing a little bit more for books. And we saw, the other thing I don't really get into, but it's the relevance of the answers. So some people would say for the book title, Twilight. Well, that kind of works, but what if they say Harry Potter? Harry Potter is not really the full book title, but it's closely related. So sometimes you'd have duplicates on things like that, which from an attack standpoint, maybe that's good that the attackers don't know exactly what you're answering, but in some cases it's maybe going to give you a weaker answer than you anticipated your users providing. Uniqueness was actually pretty good, like I said, on the cousin's first and last name, because that gives you more points of distinction. If it's just a last name, there's going to be more duplicates than there are if you're going to have first and last name required. But look at the vacation question. You can see that a lot of people, we're just asking for a country name, there's a lot more similarities in what people are choosing. I've got the slide, actually, let me go back really quick. One of the studies I reference here, they looked across multiple questions and they found that about, using just guessing the top 5 answers, not even looking at all duplicates, but only the top 5, they could get about 10% of the users answers within those 5 guesses. And that would depend on the question too. It was anywhere from under 10% up to 50%, depending on the question. And we'll kind of look a little bit more into that. So the vacation country. Remember this is the question says vacation dream country. Europe. We're not the only Europeans here in the world. Apparently Europe is a country. But you can also kind of see, and I have kept things the way exactly that they were phrased. Like I said, America, United States of America, United States of America, USA. These are all different choices. Obviously, it's a very similar answer, but from a security standpoint, some of them would probably be rejected. Now, number 5 and number 10, some systems actually check for how close the answer is, not if it's an exact match. So they might still have been counted the same. But you can kind of get an idea that some of these things are going to be very popular just based on the fact that people like to, especially depending on where they're located in the world, they may want to go. Americans may say England, Ireland, Italy. If they're located somewhere else, they may say something different. So I had a little bit tougher job when it came to alpha and echo because that was where users were allowed to write their own questions. So I had to kind of say, first of all, how do I group these together? Because I don't want to have every single different variation of a single question be counted differently. So I looked at kind of, once again, ignoring case but not ignoring punctuation. I looked at how I would match these so I could say any of these count. This question is essentially, what is my mother's maiden name? And then I also had to reject some and classify those differently. So mother's name obviously is not necessarily mother's maiden name. It could be, but we don't have any way of knowing that. Maiden name, same type of thing. It could be the user's maiden name. It could be their mother-in-law's maiden name. We just don't have enough information to know. So this has caused me a great deal of consuming my time because I've had to go through and map these back to the right questions, which has been fairly difficult. Still an ongoing process. Those 780,000 questions in alpha, I have not gotten through, but in echo. But in alpha, I looked at the questions that had at least 5 or more duplicates, and kind of looked at once again how they ranked as far as what people were choosing. The first number there, the 1,302, is how many different users chose that question. And the variations is basically how many different ways was that phrased. So going back to this slide, any of these in the matches column would be a variation of what is my mother's maiden name. So again, we see users choosing very common things. We would kind of, as far as popular answers, common things that we've used for phone systems, for if you call into customer service to get your account name reset. Again, dog's name is pet's names are very popular. And the reason that I said, like, I separated dog or pet's name from pet, they may have the same answers from an attack standpoint. An attacker could just say, I know that whether it's a mother's maiden name or a person's last name or a father's last name, they can say, I'm just going to try to attempt popular last names. And that's probably going to work in many cases unless they're doing a targeted type of attack where they want to specifically try to seek out information on that specific user. So like I said, I found it interesting just as far as how those questions are grouped. Just these top 10 questions accounted for about 24% of the users. So your favorite color, and this is a popular explanation for a bad question because, as you know, there's a decent number of colors, but people's colors tend to be fairly predictable, and this is pretty much what I found in this case too. If you want to choose, if you only have 3 guesses to try to guess someone's security question to get into their account, you've got a pretty good starting place here as far as the questions you want to try. The likelihood that you're going to get correct is pretty high if you go with one of these. So sure, there were people that said burgundy or aquamarine, but they're in that 10% that really, unless again you're trying to get into a targeted account, it's not that difficult. So that's obviously a problem. I kind of talked about. I'm trying to release more information about some of the other choices as well, which I'll do in paper as opposed to trying to cram it all in this presentation. Yes.
I'm sorry if you mentioned this while I was taking a piss. Where did you get all this data?
So this basically came from 3 websites that had their password databases posted on the internet. These 3 organizations here, they were all
willingly, or that was just exposed?
I don't think they willingly put it. Yes, unless it was just a backup gone awry. I don't think their passwords, security questions, and stuff ended up on the internet. Yeah, and basically in 2 of these, in all 3 of these cases, hackers essentially posted it on either Pastebin or another site.
So all your data comes from these 3 sources?
Unless I'm referencing another study, yes. So links, and I talked a little bit briefly about length earlier. So the first thing you notice is, obviously, kind of like passwords, we're seeing a lot of answers being in that 6 to 8 character range, a lot of shorter types of answers, which is, I don't want to say it's fine. It may be expected because some of these answers only are going to have 5, 6, 7, 8 character answers. And if you want people to answer them honestly, that's the kind of answers you're going to be stuck with. And from an attacker standpoint, if they're trying to guess them, if you look up here with Alpha and Echo, who had only a single character requirement, you can see that a large percentage of them had 1 character answers, 2 character answers. You're not looking at having a lot of variety. Part of that may be from just the standpoint if they didn't understand what this information was, being asked for a secret answer and secret question, I'm just going to put down whatever. But in some cases, it may be, again, going back to that memorability. I just want to remember, the letter A. I'm going to put A in if I get this security question. Sierra, on the other hand, did require a 5-character minimum answer. And kind of to your point earlier, if your dog's name is Max, what are you going to do? You can't answer that accurately given the fact that you have to put in 6 characters. So you can do Max dog, my dog is Max, Max 1, 2, 3. You have to come up with some sort of variation of that and then try to remember what variation you used as a user. So from our standpoint, it's more secure. From their standpoint, it's more difficult for them to remember, possibly going to cause problems going forward. If you look within just 10 questions, within 10 characters, you've got about 90% of the questions answered within that standpoint, except for Sierra. It had a little bit more outliers outside that. So this is also an interesting one and kind of shows you where things go horribly awry if you let users write their own questions. The first one's not really a security issue so much as a usability problem. They thought that by putting their password as the answer, that was going to help them remember somehow, but they're not provided with the answer, so they've really just locked themselves out of the password recovery process as well. The answer matches their email name. There were a couple of those in the Sierra and Echo cases. Answer matches the username. Again, these things, if an attacker is prepped or knows this information, which they're going to know the username for sure, possibly the email address. But answer matches the question. This is where you've essentially taken the sticky note where someone wrote their password down on the side of their monitor and moved it on to your, actually that's the second one, but having their actual password posted on your website where anyone that can get into that point in the recovery process can just then go back and log in as a user because their password is displayed there. The other one is that the answer matches the question. So if you're going to try to get into their account and their question is dog, just try answering dog, or if it's rabbit, whatever. So that gives an attacker certainly an advantage in these sites if he knows. And you can see a difference statistically on Echo, which I would say as an online gaming site probably had the younger and maybe less security conscious crowd, or people who just didn't care about those particular accounts. It happened a lot more in those cases. Question matching the password though, that's a difficult problem because you can put systems in place during the registration process that says don't match their password. If they try to type this into the field, don't allow it. A couple things that you can still hash the password, but you have to keep a copy of it in memory until you get to this point. The other problem is, what if they just say, my password is, and then they list their password. It's much, you have to do some regex stuff and get a little bit crazy about how am I trying to see if their password is listed in this question. I will also mention, if you're using security phrases, as some online banks and other systems use, that phrase that's displayed to the user after they put in their username that says, hey, whatever custom phrase they've designed to make sure that they're not being a man in the middle. Often those are the same type of situation where they can just put their password there to be displayed during the login process. Pretty dangerous. So my suggestions, don't let users write their own questions. You can do it. It's going to be very difficult to try to avoid some of the pitfalls that some people are going to choose when they're choosing to write their own questions. I don't think it's worth the security trade-off to give them that flexibility. Combinations has kind of always been the recommended approach. Going back to the Cisco example, they do require me to have all 3 answers to my 3 security questions before they then email me the password reset link, so at least they're doing some things right. But that's certainly a better combination, because each time you're adding one more question to be answered, you're usually pretty significantly increasing the burden on the attacker to have to guess multiples right in the correct order at the same time. In some cases, it kind of depends on how you're doing that. Mixing with other controls, like I said, an email link, prompting them for other account information. Maybe some banks I've seen, they prompt for the last 4 of your social security number, your email address, some other information, and then also your security answer. So at least you're, again, making the burden more difficult for attackers. But I also don't think it should stop there. I think we should look into other alternatives. At some point you have to say, okay, we're already going to email them this link, we're sending an SMS to their phone, we're doing XYZ. Is it even worth it to have the security question as that front gate? Or is it just causing more problems? Because some of the surveys and studies on security questions in the past have still shown around a 20% forget rate of users of what their security questions is. If you want to have a fun night, go home, or even just sitting here, go look on Twitter for security answer Apple or security answer iTunes, and I guarantee you'll find like a dozen posts from people who can't get their iTunes purchase because it's prompting them for the security answers and they don't remember what it was. So, fun times there.
Are they posted on Twitter?
Well, they're not posting their security answers, they're posting a complaint that they've forgotten their security answers. Although there is a fun Twitter need a debit card, which retweets people posting pictures of their debit cards, so that will keep you busy if you don't find the security.
They take them down after a while.
I'm sure they do. So from our standpoint, I mean, encouraging people to use password managers is, I think, a good piece of advice. It doesn't necessarily remove these mechanisms from the website, but it can kind of help offload the burden of those companies thinking they need to supply that type of mechanism, which may not be that secure to begin with. Kind of your point where you asked earlier about should we fill it in with random information or should we answer it honestly? We get lots of conflicting advice in that. I've kind of split screen here. The first is from Bruce Schneier, where he talks about back 6-7 years ago about typing in random answers. Some password managers even support fields for that, where you can type in, this was my question, this is my random answer, and it'll even generate it for you. I don't have a problem personally doing that. I don't answer mine honestly. But the problem comes when we tell users, especially the second one is a website for just a financial website out there that says, do not make up false answers. They're trying, once again, to ensure that users are going to remember what they typed in and try to preserve the usability of the system, not so much the security. So my complaint is, if these are insecure enough that we say we shouldn't use real information, let's get rid of it. Let's stop trying to band-aid solution these insecure systems. So my advice would be, instead of telling someone to try to focus more energy on getting rid of these questions if we don't think they have secure answers.
We are never.
So some ongoing thing, like I didn't really talk much about the alpha questions. It's taking a lot of time to parse through the data, but I am continuing to do it and seeing what other correlations. Judging strength of passwords or strength of answers can be very subjective, but I would like to see, do people who choose better security answers also have good passwords, or are they completely unrelated? How well word lists work, like I said, some of the, just guessing the top 5 popular answers in another study yielded a pretty good result, and I'm going to try to do that with these. I just haven't had time to go through it. And again, I don't really have much more demographic information for my study, but I did think it was interesting. If someone lives in a specific location, you can probably guess their favorite sports teams, like in Kansas City, the Chiefs or the Royals or something like that. How predictable are those types of trends? So here's the references. If you don't have to write these down right now, I've got a link to my website where I've got a copy of these slides, and where I'll eventually get that paper up that has much more detail on these answers. But that's where to go. So, any questions?